Stress is not something we particularly invite or enjoy, but it tends to come our way. I think of my dear wife right now, who's not with me. And in this particular case, we came back from England. Of course, as many of you have known and prayed, it's been a couple of years since she relocated to Edmonton just to please my heart. I'm sure there are a few other reasons as well, but I look at it that way. That was a precious thing to do, my dear. But looking for some sort of employment that would be comparable, anything comparable to what she had in Calgary. But that was in the good old days before things wound back a little bit and Fort McMurray burnt down and, we had problems with pipelines and everything else. But after, praying for a couple of years, some months ago, she lucked into a situation where she went to work for supposedly part-time, and she was going to put this together with part-time with another part-time situation she had, and this was going to all work out. She could manage the time and everything else. Well, it turns out that it was a little more than part-time, and in this particular case, we came back from England just over a week ago, and she went to work, and of course, it seems as though this company is expanding, and so she's into far more work than she expected. In fact, she's had the help of 2 other people over the last week or so, so this part-time job apparently is full-time enough for 3 people right now. And this produces a certain measure of stress, and also work on, last weekend was a long weekend. I was working Sunday, working Monday, and still not on top of it. And so you get a certain amount of, how can I put it, dissatisfaction with life. Okay, now I'm too blessed. Back off with all this blessing. And at that particular point, you say, well, you don't have enough time, you don't have enough energy, it's stressful, you're feeling my age, not just yours, things like that. And what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you think, what do you do when you feel overwhelmed, when you feel that you can't cope? You give yourself counsel, perhaps, from just numerous sources. There's just the standard answers, which I tried to practice. Well, take a step back. Consider what you're up against. Consider the worst case scenario. What could happen if things went in this direction or went in that direction? Now that you're doing that, tackle this challenge, this problem, this overwhelming circumstance in the traditional ways. What do? We ask questions like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, exactly. It's sometimes called the Swiss cheese method. Poke holes in it. Do what you can now, and don't worry about what you can't do right now, because you'll get a chance tomorrow, hopefully, to do it then. Things like that. And so that's the way we tend to work things. Perhaps as you're doing that, you say, now look, where is the end of all this? If you take this first step with the end in mind, starting with the end in mind to this particular journey, you'll feel a little bit better, and you perhaps, you'll eat the right spoonful. You'll poke the right hole in the cheese today, and you'll get there in a little more tranquil manner. But either way, even though you say all those things, it can be quite overwhelming and quite distressing. And as Jesus brought to us a certain counsel for life in Luke 12 and verse 32, he said these simple words. He said, look, don't be stressed. Don't be afraid. Don't feel overwhelmed. And the response I might give to that is easy for you to say. But he is coming from, and there's nothing wrong with the sort of advice you might give to a friend. A burden shared is a burden cut in half. Advice received helps you to calm your nerves. I try to be that calming influence in the middle of whatever distress we might be discussing after the end of a distressing day. But nonetheless, we have to go back all the way to the beginning of our journey and ask, well, what does Jesus say about this? Jesus is not against anything we've just discussed here, but he starts with the biggest picture of all in mind. Do not be afraid. Well, okay, why are you saying that, boss? Why are you saying that, Lord? Why are you saying that, my friend? Jesus, why are you saying that? Well, he then says simply, little flock. In other words, okay, you are powerless. You feel that way. You are small in number. You feel that way. Now, putting this in context, he is speaking to his original disciples, the small group he gathered around himself, because humanly speaking, Jesus couldn't relate to many more people than you or I could. He didn't, quote, overtax his energies to the point where he would just be talking himself to death and trying to touch too many bases. It's been well established that, if you happen to ever find yourself in an extremely influential position as the Lord and Master of a mega corporation, the advice that has been distilled from many different consulting gurus is this: you can't relate to more than about 3 or 4 people. That's it. You can have about 3 or 4 people answer directly to you. That's why Donald Trump just trusts his inner sanctum, which is his family. Those are the people he relates directly to. That's why presidents of Malta now, Rupert Murdoch deals with his sons and maybe one other, and that's about it. And then beyond that, you can't spread yourself pretty much between them and maybe other vice presidents to about a group of about 12. And after that, if you get more than 12 around the table, you're going to have you're just going to collapse under the load. And it's interesting that this wisdom was distilled from human experience, and this reflects exactly the way Jesus operated as God incarnate in the flesh, having given up all of his legal, royal, spectacularly divine prerogatives and just coming down to our level and operating. When it came down to the crunch, Peter, James, and John, you come with me. When it came down to launching and managing a huge operation like evangelizing the world, he started with a dozen, something like that. And so he says little flock. But by extension, we are still a little flock. The church is still pretty small and pretty fragile and pretty powerless. But we're told, do not be afraid. Why would you say that? What is the driving force behind your advice, Lord? Because your Father. Now, he refers to the God who created the universe now. The one who is in heaven, the one who is that spirit that animates all of us, who gives life to all things, who sustains the universe. He says, this is your Father. Talk to him as your Father. In fact, beyond that in the language, it's not just Father, it's Dad, Abba. Extremely personable. And we emphasize that because we try to understand that we have a relationship. I found myself some time ago in a very nice home, posh home. And it belonged to a family that came from a different cultural background, and as such followed a different religion than the one I follow. And at one particular point, the lady of the house said simply, I must go and pray. I thought, well, that's nice. And so she went to pray, which meant she turned on a soundtrack of a group of individuals chanting. And it came on, and then she reappeared in the kitchen, and her husband appeared. He was a late riser. And he said, hey, I will make you some breakfast. And I was there just doing something with another individual who we were just doing something very briefly together. Didn't really have time, didn't want to take a lot of time, but the offer was there. I hadn't eaten. It was about 11 in the morning. So he said, okay. And so he fried some eggs, and we sat down and ate. It wasn't so much ate, it was sort of power fueling, but it took about 10 minutes to do that. And all the time the chanting is in the background. And they're chatting, talking a little business in their particular language, maybe interacting with us a little bit. And a little bit later, I was able to see the shrine that she had gone to. And there was a statue of a god who had many hands, and so he could give many gifts, I suppose. And there was money spread before the shrine. And so there was a particular dynamic that was going on. But when we say prayer, we mean what? We mean conversation. We mean sharing. It's something that is communication. It is a highly personal thing. And I will say this, these are lovely people, obviously generous, couldn't wait to bless us with something. And do you want anything else? Can I make you tea? No thanks. I grew up in a tea culture, and that's why I drink coffee all the time. Well, okay, I'll make you coffee, and that's my friend. Do you want tea? And he's flexible. He can go coffee or tea. He's a two-way kind of guy that way. And so he took tea. And these are people who they may pray to a divinity that can, in their hopes, bless them in certain areas. They're very hardworking, very diligent, pretty fair and balanced in business as far as I know. Certainly reflect the same family values that I would hope for. I had a conversation once with one of their sons, and he had a business opportunity, but he lamented the fact that he'd have to go into a high-stress situation. I'll never forget his words. He said, I really don't want to get involved with this individual. He said, I know it's going to be this and that and the other thing. He said, I want to go home at night to his girlfriend. He said, and I just want to have a life as well as be a slave to this entrepreneur who's ready to throw literally hundreds of millions of dollars around the world and get involved with him, he said. And he just burst out whimsically. He said, my dad loves my mother, and I want to be like that. And I thought, well, okay, it shows there are values, there are hopes and aspirations that go beyond. I don't want to imply that just because the divinity that they worship or chant to or pray to or enjoy the background of chanting going to is as Paul said, we all find our way ultimately to God through Jesus Christ. But he said on the day of judgment, he said there will be from around the world those who conscience will excuse or accuse, and they will relate to the journey that they have taken to the point where they now have to accept Jesus. That's my understanding as a Christian. And so there are certain things that they have in their culture that are very good for them. But I will say that I couldn't relate to chanting. I couldn't relate to that type of prayer because in my tradition I pray to my Father in heaven. And this is what I'm coming back to. Don't be afraid even though you're powerless, because your dad has been pleased to give you the kingdom. And so this Father has given in love, in friendship, in the goodness and the kindness of his heart, the kingdom. What does it mean when it says he's given me the kingdom? Well, what Jesus is saying, he's given you me. That's why in his message, as he traveled around, he said, repent. In other words, change direction, start thinking differently, for the kingdom of his God is among you. He was referring to himself. The kingdom of God is near. He is referring to himself. God has come to you. And this is something that's a little more difficult to understand. It sometimes is a challenge to folks to understand, let's say, why Paul will say in Ephesians that he has seated you upon thrones in heavenly places. Because you look around and it says, I don't see a throne, and I don't feel heavenly. It's difficult to understand and to relate to the idea that Jesus in his resurrection is said to be ascending into heaven in this triumphant victory parade and drawing us with him. And so when we read things like that, we are so literal in our thinking, we don't grasp it, because we don't look and see of us physically there yet. And we'll never physically be there. We'll be spiritually there, and spirit bodies and so forth. We have trouble with passages like Revelation 20 that says that the saints are seated on thrones and, quote, judge the world. which is a concept that Paul brings out, and he says, we are not judged by others, but we have the perception and the understanding to come to conclusions and to understand what's around us. And so, they want to take very literally something like it says, seated on thrones, reigning for 1,000 years, and make a very physical kingdom out of that. Whereas in reality, the point of the picture is to say that we are already there. We are already living with Jesus in this relationship that is the already part of the kingdom. And that we're just completely secure and reassured. And based on this, we don't have to have room for fear and misgivings and feel stressed and worried beyond measure. Now, there is a certain matter of stress that you do not avoid in life. My wife, again, reminded me of that when we were in England, because she was seated on the left, and she's rather how can I put it in terms of driving? She's an alpha, simple as that. She has a better license than I have. They trust her with a school bus and children's lives, and she doesn't quite, plus I think, as a teenager, I think she was in a bad accident, and so whatever it is, however it is, comes together as she's sitting in the side there where she thinks she should be sort of in control, but she isn't. And she sees the hedgerow right here, which it is, and then there's a certain certain response. So you're not going to avoid stresses like that. And if any of you repeat this information in my presence or hers, I will deny all knowledge of it. But anyway, on a rare occasion, who am I saying? Quite often she makes critical comments of my driving. But I'm an open-hearted guy, and I roll past these criticisms, basically because my mother is far worse. My mother refuses to be in the car. She put it so tactlessly to my brother, "I'm happy to go anywhere as long as an English driver is in charge." You're making a point, Mom. You're making a point. And so anyway, you're going to have natural, normal stresses. And so the natural, normal response is back off, calm down, take the big picture and all those things, which flow from this understanding. But we're going, to the macro picture now. We're going to the big picture, that you have to understand that this is all under God's purview and His control. And this is the lesson that we take out of this. Now, to his immediate little group here, he says, sell your possessions and give to the poor, which, of course, brings up, there's a certain amount of tension in that conversation. I don't know anybody here, and I don't know anybody personally who's ever sold their possessions and given it all to the poor. This is the thought that immediately comes to mind, but Jesus is speaking to some extent metaphorically. I am not averse to a certain measure. Can I say this to Albertans? I'm not averse to, I grew up in a socialist country, so I see certain benefits to socialism, which is why I don't resent buying auto insurance, where we pool our risk, we pool the reality, where I am required by law to take responsibility in a social way for my neighbor. If I clip you on the way out of the parking lot and you sue me, I have insurance. In fact, you don't even have to sue me, you just have to come to me. I remember, now this can obviously be abused. I knocked the rear bumper of an individual who was from a different country. Just a slightest touch. Was it a mistake on my part? Absolutely. Was it anything I can justify? No. I just, rolled slightly forward and touched his rear bumper. Ironically, he came from a different culture and country, and the first thing he did was to get out of his car, which, by the way, was an old beater, walk immediately towards me and say, "We must report this to police. I must be compensated." Compensated, dude? Well, whatever for? There was no whiplash. There was no nothing. And he opened the trunk and 5 or 6 times did this. Didn't touch the trunk, man. What is up with you? But we need to go to the police, and the police need to make you pay me money, was the attitude that he had. And so happy to report it to the police. Happy to go ahead and I don't know how the insurance company handled that situation, but I know if you want to take it any further, they had some pretty heavy-duty lawyers who would say, now, do you have any evidence that you were injured or anything like that? Because he obviously wasn't. I obviously protested my innocence to the insurance company because I'm willing to stand up for myself. But the point is, if I ever do any damage to another human being, I mean real damage, I carry liability insurance because I don't have the resources personally to do anything for you right now. But by being compelled by law to do the socially responsible thing, I am able to meet my obligation if I hurt someone. I do the same for my house. If you come to my front door and you trip over something I stupidly left in the wrong place and I'm liable, you can be taken care of. And I feel the same way about health care. I grew up in a country where everybody could have their eyes looked at, their teeth managed. In fact, I hated that as a child. That it was almost legally required that I go and get my teeth fixed. The legend that British older have bad teeth, well, if they have bad teeth, it's by choice, okay? Because I remember going to the dentist and sitting there with that old-fashioned drill just grinding away and suffering much pain as a child because I had problems with my mouth. And so I don't resent health insurance, and I am very, very grateful the experiences I've gone through for the Canadian healthcare system. With all its failings and flaws, it's okay. Now, does that mean I'm, tending towards communism? No, okay. I function as a landlord, and that is to say I manage a few little things which the bank really owns. And I notice that people who rent take far less interest in caring for their environment than people who own, okay? However, the problems may be of my house, it's my house. As my wife informs me on an occasional basis, we got to fix this. Why? Because it's ours, and we got to take care of it. I don't hear that coming from renters, okay? I know, just a simple example, when the Chinese couldn't feed themselves, they said, why doesn't anybody who wants to take a little patch of land and call it theirs start growing their vegetables? And that was the beginning of sort of this transformation in China, that if a person had a little patch of land that was theirs, they grew their vegetables and then some so they could sell it to somebody else. And that's sort of creeping capitalism is what began to really get their economy going. When I was in the Ukraine, we drove past a rather interesting ramshackle collection of buildings, and I asked the guide, what's that? He said, that's the communal farm. That was the communal farm. I said, well, who's there now? He said, no one. Nobody wants to be forced and herded together in a commune except those who choose that, like perhaps Hutterites or Mennonites or other communities that do it driven by their own religious principles. And so there's a real tension for me as a Christian: sell your possessions and give to the poor. Lord, exactly what do you want to do with this? What do you want me to do with this? I know I didn't grow up in a culture where I saw people, let's say, begging on the streets. These days, you go to Home Depot, maybe you'll be accosted in the parking lot. And there'll be signs in many businesses that say, please don't reward panhandlers. And so at times I felt hard-hearted, but I know that the individuals, and I think one or two of us have had this experience as well, to where you'll see somebody in the West End Home Depot, in my case, and then you go to another Home Depot on the north side, and you see the same person with the same story. And you say, hey, man, you hit me 5 days ago on the West End. Who are you trying to kid? I was kind of shocked on this particular trip home to England. My wife and I spent 3 full days in London, and there were people begging on the streets. Never seen that before. But they weren't begging with an English accent. They weren't begging in a way. They were praying, they were begging, they were crying, and imputing to gods that I perhaps don't personally worship, and implying that, if I had any compassion or godliness, I would be giving them money. I mean, right at the Tower of London. This is an imported culture from somewhere else. It doesn't mean to say there haven't always been poor people in England, but they've never conducted themselves in that way. And, you have this tension within your soul, as Jesus once said to somebody who criticized him for receiving an expensive gift, the poor you have with you always, and there will always be the poor. I know as Albertans, we're probably not big on, can I see the hands of all of you who would welcome higher taxes? Oh, I know, okay, all right, okay. I guess we're all in the same boat, But here's the point when it comes to tax. I pay taxes, you pay taxes, and we do pool our resources that way, and we do have certain support systems for those who are poor. One of the fairer taxes, I think, is GST. Hands up all those who love GST. All right, no supporters there either. But you see, to me, GST is a tax on consumption, in as much as, if I got, I was talking to a young man here recently, and he was sitting behind the wheel of his Maserati, all right? How many of you have a Maserati? Still no hands, okay. And so we had this talk about, his Maserati, and he said, I thought it was like, if you get a really heavily loaded pickup truck, nice one, you're going to pay X. And I thought, well, you probably get a bottom line Maserati for X. So, but he allowed that he had paid X times 2, something like that. And I thought, oh, okay, that's more than I expected. And but he said, I didn't exactly pay that much. I huffed and snorted and got 20% off. Okay, good for you. You come from a culture that values, bargaining hard, okay? And apparently you did that. But the point is, he probably paid still twice as much as I would ever pay for a brand spanking new, well-equipped truck, let's say, which would be my preference to drive. More space, same quality stereo, and, things like that. But he wanted to pay twice as much. Let's pretend he even had twice as much. Which probably, he has 10 times as much. But the point is, that particular tax, he paid twice as much tax as you or I might if we bought a brand spanking new, heavily loaded vehicle. And so there is a certain social aspect to that. You paid you wanted twice as much, but you also paid twice as much. And so, there is a certain responsibility and a certain, quote, if you want to call it that, if you think in taxes as penalties, you paid twice the penalty, all right? You contributed twice as much to the social system. And there are ways to, of course, avoid income tax. There are ways to avoid all sorts of things. But GST is kind of fair. It's 5% for you, it's 5% for me. It's 5% for him if he wants to pay twice as much for a car that goes apparently twice as fast as my truck. But you see, we do have things in place in our society. Actually, we had a conversation just driving to church this morning because we passed a couple of shopping carts loaded with stuff. And Arnold said, I've seen that guy moving around, pulling his house. And immediately I feel, okay, what would Jesus say about that? Does he really want me to sell my house and share it with this man who apparently chooses to have no house? Because he could live in some accommodation. Even in our social structure, we do provide for those who are absolutely destitute. And so there's a certain, just as that lady, and I saw several of them begging in front of the Tower of London, imported a culture from somewhere. So this individual made choices to live on the street. Maybe there's mental illness that needs to be addressed. Maybe there are all sorts of other factors. But I can't, just sell my house and split it with this individual. And I don't think this is what Jesus is requiring. On the other hand, he says, don't resent paying your taxes. Don't resent helping out. Don't resent pulling your resources for auto insurance or health care insurance. These are socially responsible things to do. On the other hand, don't expect people to work for you. Again, dealing with certain individuals, I noticed that the more I would do, they will take that as the less I have to do. Oh, you want to do more, Bob? Then I have to do less. You want to work an extra hour? Then I can quit early. You want to lower the rent? Then I can have more money for what I want to do. Things like that. No, there's a certain balance that has to be there. And so Jesus is not advocating, and of course the evidence is that the immediate audience for this, the disciples, okay, what did they do? Well, they had to literally give up. Peter did no longer live in Capernaum at a very large home, enough for his family, enough for his mother-in-law, enough for Jesus to have rooms there as well. Peter traveled the world. And also we understand he took his wife with him, according to Paul. Because Paul argued with the Corinthian church. He said, couldn't I have a wife and take her with me, just like Peter? Things like that. And so these individuals had to give up certain things like permanent homes. On the other hand, as you read the letters of Paul, for example, you'll find individuals with permanent homes, permanent households, were complimented for being generous and sharing in their particular situation. So having gone through that whole thing, do we take it as a literal imperative that everybody here today should sell your possessions and give to the poor? Because some of you are a lot better off than me, and I'm relatively poor. See, no, he's not saying that. He's not saying that in quite that way. But to the original apostles, there was an imperative that they had to literally do this. But what is the lesson he's trying to get across to you and to me? Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. Well, there's no such thing. All purses wear out. You know, if you ever had a leather wallet, yeah, I had one. It was kind of nice. It was cowhide. It was actually a burgundy color. I bought it at, I think, whatever it was, the World Exhibition or whatever we called it in the early to mid-'80s in Vancouver. But after about 10 years, you know, it was cowhide and it wore out. I had a sealskin one. It wore out after 10, 15 years. Now I have another one. It's generic, it's brown, and, you know, it's holding together a little bit better. But no purse lasts forever. But he's now saying, look, get a purse that will not wear out. And what's the thing that wears out? It doesn't wear out. It is that which is my relationship with God. And it doesn't wear out because he lasts forever, and he's going to give me the opportunity to last forever as well. And this is what he is saying in this sort of almost threefold parallel statement. Purse that won't wear out, treasure in heaven that will never fail. You know, now I put a little bit of treasure into an RRSP, and I put that treasure into, quote, the market, and that market has gone backwards, not forwards. I've used the illustration. I think when I turned 50, I went to Rapid Ron, my guru, and I said, here is a little nesty egg, make me a millionaire, and, you know, facetiously saying that. And he, in good conscience, with my approval and cooperation, invested it. And it was locked in for 5 years. And after 5 years, it had grown by minus 10%. We took two great minds together, and we put our treasure there, my treasure there, and after 5 years, it had grown by minus 10%. And that's when I said, boy, this is not good. And he said, you know, if I had been you, I would have done this. Wait a second, what mistake did I make there? I didn't ask for any counsel, I just offered a thought. He took the thought, he acted upon it in good conscience, and as a result of my own wisdom, I did absolutely badly. And that's when I began to take a little more interest. If you ever want to have little something to call your fallback position, you better listen to him and not offer opinions. I've been, as I sometimes tease Bernie, he's retired now, but he had a chance to fix the world economy, and he didn't quite pull it off when he was working. And But apparently he couldn't get to the three powerful people that control everything. That's, by the way, it's a joke. You know, there are people who really believe they're like four or five people who control everything. There isn't. There's just all of us running our Visa cards up further than we should. And that's where the responsibility comes back to. And so Jesus is saying, you know, don't get a purse that's going to wear out. Don't put your treasure in a place where it's going to just go backwards by 10% faster than you think. And find a place that's not a strong box or whatever you think is good. But he says, look, put it in heaven where it will never fail. And furthermore, there are no moths, okay, or thieves in my place. That's the where you have to have it. In other words, don't just vest yourself. And that's the whole point of this verse. He's not saying just dump everything, give it away, and just live with the birds. He's saying, do not think that there's any security in this box you call your house that you own 50% of, thanks to the bank taking payments every Monday. Don't think there's any security in this purse that's going to wear out. Don't think there's any strong, long comfort in this place where thieves and moths, and I might even say mice, can break through, nibble it up, and destroy. These things fail. They fail so quickly. We sometimes sing that song, don't we? The world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away. That's the lesson. The strength, the power, the comfort, the security that we have, the joy that we have, it comes from a source that the world doesn't provide. And furthermore, when you focus on it, the world can't take it away either. That's the constant emphasis in this verse. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And he's coming back to this great treasure that Jesus is referencing, which is himself. The relationship that we have, a relationship not based, and I mean, no, not to detract from anything here, but it's not based on putting on a record and listening to prayers offered perhaps, and that, we listen to music to inspire us, to comfort us, to lift us up a little bit. Again, she's not here, so I can say this, but if we get in the truck, my wife will switch the thing on and crank it up, and I'll say, I can't sleep with that on. Well, I can't drive without it. Oh, okay. So you need a little, what I sometimes refer to, it's so loud it's headbanging. No, it's just adrenaline pumping, All right, so music, we have different types. Rap works for some people. Chanting works for some people. But what we as Christians understand is conversation, an ongoing conversation that flows from an ongoing relationship with Jesus, that comforts us, that strengthens us, that brings to mind the answer to the challenge I'm facing right now. My kids are in trouble. I have a bill that I didn't expect, The truck rolled over, and this is going to create some chaos, How's God going to fix this? Well, we've all got our lives. We've all got our strength here. But now we got to fix something. Now we got to scramble to, this isn't right. This isn't good. This is not something that I planned for. Well, where your treasure is, where your confidence has been vested in, then your heart will follow there. And you will find the security and the comfort and the answers to the questions that you need. The theme that's coming out here is this, and we go all the way back to that expression at the beginning. Your Father is pleased to give, okay? Your Father is pleased to give. And the relationship other people have with their deities, the Babylonians used to have their deities, and the Greeks and the Romans. But what sort of gods did they serve? The gods were, frankly, cruel. The gods treated people as their slaves, their merchandise, their servants. Their gods might give you something if you were lucky, but you had to work pretty hard for it. And here we've been introduced to God is pleased to give. You know, think about that. How often do you give? Let's say we all gave around March or April, right? We all filled in our income tax. All right? Now, despite this discussion that I had about social responsibility, how many of you perhaps discovered you had to pay a little bit more and you were pleased to give it? Again, no hands go up. Why am I not surprised? You know, when somebody said, I got a bill, you know, when we rolled the truck, they sent me a bill for the fire truck that showed up. And I mean, it was, you know, a couple of $1,000s. Just, hey, we came because somebody called us. We went a couple of $1,000 for that. I was not pleased to receive that bill. I was not pleased to give, all right? But hey, we showed up. Of course, there were 4 other people in the ditch and all sorts of other chaos happening that particular night. And so I'm sure, and I discovered that had I a certain measure of insurance, which I didn't think I had, they would have automatically covered it. Shared social responsibility. Do you know the great blessing that came to be about 6 weeks ago? Because I didn't pay the bill yet. I didn't have it. I didn't have room on the visa. And I got a phone call from my insurance company and said, we got this bill here for a couple of $1,000 from the, do you know anything about it? I said, well, I guess it's on me because I didn't buy the insurance. And they said, well, actually you did. I did? Yeah, you had coverage on your truck. I said, I didn't know that. I thought that it was so old and clunky, I didn't buy it. No, you actually had collision insurance on it. Does that mean you'll pay the $1,600? Yeah, we'll pay it. Thank you, Lord. Well, what about the towing charge they sent me for $1,000? Because AMA was going to do it for free, but, you know, the police got there first. Well, we'll pay that one too. Well, what about the fact that I lost the truck? Well, it wasn't worth much, but we'll pay you a little something. Oh, wow. Suddenly, you know, I didn't even know I had that insurance. And I assumed that I didn't have that coverage, and so I didn't bother them by even reporting it. So they said, well, we need to assess the condition of the truck. And of course, this happened last November. And I said, where is it? And I said, in the wrecker's yard. So they checked and said, well, I'm sorry, it's already been crushed. What condition was it in before they crushed it? I said, it was in perfect shape. No, I didn't tell them that. I told them what the mileage was and everything else. And, but it had leather seats. That's worth something, right? And so we went through that little voyage of discovery together. So just when you think sometimes you're in the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. Well, I thought I was the bug and I was getting crushed. In this particular case, the crush wasn't quite as bad as it could have been because it was feeling there for a while. So what I'm saying is I was not pleased to give any of that. You are not necessarily pleased when somebody tells you you're responsible to do. Your Father, however, is pleased to give, and it's not because he has to. He doesn't have a sense of duty. It's implied here that by nature, the reason he made us is so that he could give to us. He could offer us something he already had. You see, he already had eternity. He already had all the power and the glory and everything else. He's not some like Babylonian God or Greek God or Egyptian God who created us so that he could have somebody constantly saying, oh, you are so great and I am so unworthy. He did not do it that way. He, first of all, created us not out of duty, but out of his very nature, which is his generosity. And his generosity says that he is pleased to give. And so we come back full circle to this statement. So take notice of this. Back off, get the big picture, talk to him, because he is going to, if you vest yourself with him, he is going to see you through and reward you, in quotes, bless you, definitely. He's going to bring joy to you, not just for now, but for eternity. Which is why, even though, and we sang that song a few moments ago, we say, yes, Lord, and we trade, it said sorrow, we trade shame, and I wrote it down as we were singing it, we trade sickness, we trade pain for the joy of the Lord. This is the message Jesus is trying to get across to us right here and right now. Invest your treasure, which is your time, your energy, your love, your emotion in your relationship with God. And if that means occasionally you bless other people physically, yes, you do that. And again, I do take a very strong imperative here, not just through tax, but also through personal responsibility, things that I've done, things I've been able to do. I think back over my years in ministry, and there were times when I had access to more money, and I would be responsible to share it with certain people. And I think of a number of families who were helped. I'm just thinking of one family right now, 4 kids, and frankly, the man involved, you might say, was less than responsible. And he would often call me up and say, can you help me out, unquote. But there were times when I may or may not have given just a little bit more, certainly in time and energy and emotion to help him. Frankly, he had certain problems, and eventually he ended his own life, which is kind of sad. But of those 4 kids, I think 2 of them went on to get doctorates. The other 2 went on to be successful in life. And there were times when I thought, this guy hits me one more time, I'm going to be very frustrated. And there were times when I, as I said, gave personally. There were times when I gave funds that other people trusted me with. And so it's always a decision, and I want to pass across that point too quickly, where it talks about remembering to help the poor and give to the poor. That's why, as I said, again, I don't regret and I don't resent certain social programs that require us to contribute and to share. But the great lesson of this little section of Scripture is the greatest investment I have ever made is in my relationship with God. Committing to that, carrying through with that, and having that diminish my fear now and my fear of the future. And I share with you that with you, and I commend that to you, and I hope in your conversations with a loving Father who gives, not out of duty, but by nature, and just doesn't give, but is generous. Even perhaps as I prayed for wisdom, not knowing where it might lead me, finding out that, I actually had something back there that I didn't even know existed. And he brought it to the fore and helped me just a little bit to get past the crisis that came from being in a traffic accident and having some of those things go. It's amazing how he intervenes in our lives at the twists and turns, not in such a way that I can write that up and claim that as a spectacular miracle to convince somebody else to become a Christian, but in a way that convicts me that my prayers are heard by a generous Father. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, today we try to understand the words of our Savior Jesus, bring them into our lives, live by them, practice them, and realize that rather than giving us the spirit of fear, you have given us the spirit of a sound mind that raises hope in our hearts, that with you all will be well, that we are comforted, we are strengthened, and we thank you for your love. And we do this today in Jesus' name. Amen.